Layla Moran.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to start by thanking the Honourable Member for Rotherham for securing this incredibly important debate. So notwithstanding whatever state the government may be in now, the latest apparently being that they can't find MPs to fill the roles for all the ministers that have now resigned, I think what this debate does show, this incredibly important debate does show, is that Parliament continues to work even if the government doesn't. Now, last week, we debated the government's thoroughly un-British plan to go back on their word and break the promise over the Northern Ireland Protocol. And today, we must be reminding ourselves that this is another broken promise made right at the beginning of the Prime Minister's premiership that has been broken. I found it interesting, the remarks of the Prime Minister when he says, clearly, in relation to the MP for Tamworth, some people don't change. Well, I'm afraid that that's what we've seen in this Prime Minister as well, because he has, and the decisions that this government have made are wrecking our global reputation, not just domestically, but internationally too. The diplomatic service, the BBC World Service, the British Council, and of course, and what I think quite rightly has been the focus of the debate today, the international development budget. Now, the Liberal Democrats are particularly proud that it was us who brought the bill that enshrined point 7 in law, but that was cross-party. And I think it was a settled matter among MPs across the whole of this House that it was in all of our manifestos and we collectively promised it. So it was a promise broken by this government to the British people to renege on point 7, and shame on them. But perhaps the good that will come from the eventual fall, the inevitable fall of this Prime Minister is that decency and honesty might be restored to this government, and I hope, therefore, that the first act of the new incoming administration might be to restore the aid budget immediately. But it is this government's current mishandling of this budget that I want to focus on today, because the cut on the budget has and continues to hit those countries who need it the most. The aid budget for Ethiopia. Ethiopia, Madam Deputy Speaker, you may not know, but I lived in Ethiopia. We moved there when I was 5 until I was 8. And it was in the early 80s, and people may remember the famine. We were there because my father had been given the job of economic advisor to the European mission out there. And my earliest memories of life at all was going with him to aid projects where I would meet little children my age who were emaciated, who didn't have clean water, who weren't able to go to school. And it is, I think, a success story of aid that many of those children down the line and their children would have had better prospects than perhaps the young children I met. And isn't it, therefore, in that context, in the context of the war now in Ethiopia itself, that the aid budget there has been slashed from £325 million in 2021 to 30 million in 24-25, a tenth less than. In Bangladesh, the budget will have halved from 200 million in 2020-21 to just 100 million in 2024-25. This is not a proud record of global leadership in international development. These cuts are an international disgrace, and it's impacting the most vulnerable. And now, even more than ever, because since that reneging on that promise, we now find ourselves with a war in Ukraine, which means that the 400 million people worldwide who rely on Ukrainian food supplies are finding that they can't get them. And that ongoing military crisis, that blockade of ports, and the destruction of agricultural machinery and shells strewn across fields are all preventing grain from leaving what is rightly named the breadbasket of the world. And that crisis will lead to people dying, and it will lead to further instability. I also lived in Egypt for a while. We moved there right after the revolution. And the reason why that happened, the Arab Spring, was because of the price of tomatoes and the price of bread. That kind of poverty, that kind of economic instability leads to political instability. And to the points that have been made across the House, if we are intent on helping people not have to flee, not have to come to our shores as refugees, the best investment we can make is to give that money to partners abroad who can help them have the best possible life where they want to be, in their cultures, in their homes, in those countries. So, of course, we want point 7 restored. And the Ukraine crisis is why it should be restored now. Because we, in the light of this crisis, need to step up to the plate, to the global catastrophe that is in front of us.
You've got a mouse.
Now, maybe there is hope anyway. The latest OBR forecast reveals that a return of point 7 is on the cards. The old Chancellor, forgive me, his fiscal tests are due to be met in 23-24. That's meant to be less than a year away. But it doesn't give me hope that the Treasury, now that that decision has been made, are going to give us acknowledgement that point 7 will return. Because every time they have been pressed, they refuse to say whether or not they will allow it in autumn. It should be in this autumn's budget that we return 2.7 by their own tests. Well, as has been mentioned, that was a promise under the last Chancellor. We now, as of today, have a new Chancellor. Maybe he will do the right thing and restore point 7. Now, international development was a proud thing for this country to hang our hats on. It matches our proud reputation as a development superpower. If this government was serious about global Britain, about Great Britain, it would lean in to that reputation. It had its own department. It had its own Secretary of State with a dedicated seat in the Cabinet table and at the National Security Council. The United Kingdom is a centre for excellence for international development, and we are home to institutions delivering world-leading research and development, technical expertise and project coordination. And yet, the international development strategy makes clear how far we have already fallen. Now, I thought it was interesting and instructive to, well, of course I read it, but also do a little word search. If the point of international aid is to alleviate poverty, the stated aim of this government, then why is it that it was only mentioned 9 times in the strategy? However, investment, particularly linked to trade, was mentioned 48 times in the strategy. That tells you everything you need to know about this government's priorities. And when the government announced its plans to merge the Department for International Development in the FCDO, in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, into the FCDO, we joined forces with the sector and across the House to raise concerns about what that would mean for effectiveness. Now, I'm sorry to say that that fear has come true. The strategy prioritizes bilateral aid over multilateral aid. This is fundamentally counter to the liberal ideal of working within international structures to solve the world's problems. It should be and, not or, not multilateral or bilateral. It's both. Absolutely. And those multilaterals include the United Nations. They're very often the first who can get there on the ground with dedicated teams. In urgent times of humanitarian crises, it's very often those specialist teams in those multilateral organizations who can deliver the big asks that are needed for rebuilding. So I'm deeply concerned by how this policy is going to impact the UK's ability to respond, particularly to emerging disasters. And if we're serious about tackling poverty, inequality and vulnerability across the world, it is also essential that that trade is distributed where it is most needed, not where it is most likely to benefit us. That's wrong. It's an important part of why we do aid, but it should never be the whole. Trade is important, of course it is, and aid is important, of course it is, but tying one to the other as is the direction of travel, is the wrong approach. And I remain highly concerned by this government's approach that it may be leading us towards that dark path, towards tide aid. And if people want a story of what that looked like, look at the Pergau Dam, look at the corruption that we saw under that. And if we say, well, we legislated against that, well, look what they're doing with their own legislation. They just throw it out the window when they think it's the right time.
So, give way on that point?
I will, of course.
Can I sit down for giving way? I wholeheartedly agree with what the Honourable is saying. I'm very conscious that many of the countries that my constituents have relationship with, for instance, Zimbabwe, Swaziland, Malawi, just as 3 examples. There's NGOs on the ground, there's churches groups on the ground. They understand where the real needs are, and sometimes it's better to feed into where the people's knowledge on the ground, where the real needs are, to ensure that there gets through. Would that be an example of perhaps what maybe government should be trying to do?
Thank you very much for his intervention. And in fact, I saw this in the Ukraine crisis. I've got a charity that operates in Moldova. And actually, the smaller charities are very often very nimble and can turn their knowledge straight away on the ground. But it needs to be and not all. They can't do it all. They have to do it in partnership with the multilaterals. And taking from one and not feeding into the other is the wrong approach. So on the international development strategy, it emphasises, in my view, short-term quick wins, and it's overlooking the deeper causes of poverty and vulnerability. And I'll pick on one specific example just to end, and that's about women and girls. Purportedly, that's meant to be a priority in this strategy. It claims in the strategy that the government intends to restore funding for this vital work. But I would ask the Minister to clarify, what exactly does she and the government mean by restore? To what level? Because it's not just about funding for the schools. If you aren't funding the period poverty plans, if you aren't funding sexual health plans, if you aren't funding water plans, then actually you find it's the women and girls who are the first ones to start making up that gap. And it shouldn't just be about a snappy headline of the 3 E's of education, empowerment and ending violence against women and girls. These are pointless unless they are followed up behind by things that are actually going to make a difference. And may I pay tribute again to the member for Rotherham and her committee, because it was her using privilege to release the Equalities report and made that public, that showed the government knew that their cuts were going to affect women, girls and minorities the most. And yet they have the brass neck to suggest in this strategy that it's their priority. It's the typical doublespeak that we've come to rely on from this government. If you want to see what they're actually doing, look at what they say they're doing best. And actually, by and large, you'll probably find the thing they're doing worst. I will, of course.
My honourable friend is making an incredibly powerful speech and has worked so hard in this area, and I commend her for it. But does she agree with me that the development strategy isn't? We don't know what the strategy is. It's a collection of buzzwords with a few stats put around. But where is the underpinning vision, which is meant to be the SDGs and reducing and removing poverty? It just doesn't exist.
I thank her for giving way, her intervention, and sorry, I'm the one giving way. And she's absolutely right. It is the strategy that is missing from this government completely. It's not just about the money. These are the estimates. We are debating the money. It's the right thing that we should be focusing on. But actually, and the thing that determines whether or not you are spending money effectively is if you know what it is you want to actually achieve with that money. Well, I'll tell you what the Liberal Democrat vision for that would be. And it would be the eradication of poverty, it would be human rights for all, and it would be a bolstering, not a deterioration of the international rule-based order. And I will say that under our plans, restoration of point 7, but a completely different approach to foreign policy, that would be delivered. I'm sorry to say that this government seemed to be doing the exact opposite.